The lobby of Carter Dynamics rose 4 stories into open air, all glass and polished stone. The kind of place built to make ordinary people feel small the moment they walked through the doors. On a gray Tuesday morning, a man in a faded brown jacket stepped through those doors carrying nothing but a worn leather bag and the quiet exhaustion of someone who had just landed after a long overnight flight. He walked to the front desk and said, in a voice too calm for what was about to happen to him, that he had a meeting with the chief executive officer. The young woman behind the desk looked him over, from his scuffed shoes to his unshaven jaw, and laughed before she could stop herself, telling him that people like him did not simply walk in and expect to see leadership. He did not argue. He simply found a chair near the window and sat down to wait, setting his bag beside his feet with the patience of a man who had waded through far harder things than this. 3 hours passed. Manager after manager walked by without a glance, and not one person in that building had any idea that the man they ignored was the very founder who had built their billion-dollar empire out of a 2-car garage. When the boardroom doors finally opened that afternoon, everything changed with a single sentence, spoken so quietly that at first no one believed they had heard it correctly. "I own this place," he said, and the silence that followed felt like the whole building had stopped breathing at once. The morning had started ordinarily enough, though ordinary was a strange word for a man returning to a life he had stepped away from years earlier. Ethan Carter had flown in from the coast on a red-eye, his body still running on airport coffee and too little sleep. And he had chosen not to call ahead to warn anyone of his arrival. He wanted to see the company the way a stranger would see it, without the polish that always appeared before a scheduled visit, without executives rehearsing their smiles in the mirror. He was 39 years old, though the years had put more weight on him than the number suggested. 5 of them spent caring for a wife, whose illness had slowly taken everything from her before it finally took her life as well. His children were grown now, scattered across the country building their own careers and their own families, and Ethan had spent those long years away from the company trusting it to people he believed shared his values completely. He walked into the lobby that morning wearing the same jacket he had worn to hospital waiting rooms 100 times before, and nobody in that gleaming building recognized the face that had once appeared on every wall of the very first office they had ever occupied. He approached the front desk, gave his name, and said he needed to see the chief executive, his voice quiet and unhurried, the voice of a man used to being listened to without needing to raise it. What he did not yet know was that the meeting had existed once, buried inside an email that a mid-level administrator named Derek Collins had deleted weeks earlier, mistaking the message from the founder's personal assistant for nothing more than junk mail cluttering an already full inbox. The receptionist, a sharp-eyed young woman named Melissa Grant, asked if he had confirmed an appointment, and when she searched the system twice, she found absolutely nothing under his name. She told him, without much interest, that he would need to take a seat and wait until someone had time to sort out the confusion. Her tone flat, and already drifting toward the next task on her list. Ethan nodded once and said nothing more, choosing the same worn patience that had carried him through 5 years of harder waiting rooms than this one. He sat down near the window, watching the morning light stretch across the polished floor, and allowed himself to simply observe the building he had not properly walked through in half a decade. While he waited, Ethan noticed small details most visitors would never think to notice. The way the receptionist spoke differently depending on who approached the desk, the way certain names triggered instant smiles, while others barely earned a glance upward from a computer screen. He watched a young mother arrive with a folder full of paperwork, clearly nervous, clearly hoping for a fair hearing on some small vendor contract, and he watched her get waved toward a waiting area far less comfortable than the one reserved for men in tailored suits. He thought of his late wife then, of the countless waiting rooms they had sat in together during those final years, rooms where kindness had sometimes meant more than any medical outcome ever could. He thought of his children, grown now and building lives of their own, and wondered briefly what they would think if they could see the company that bore their family's legacy treating strangers this way. He did not reach for his phone to call anyone, did not ask to speak with security, did not raise his voice even once. He simply watched and remembered and waited, the way he had learned to wait through 5 long years of far heavier things than this. The first hour passed easily enough, the kind of patience that comes naturally to a man who has sat beside hospital beds, waiting for news far worse than any office delay could ever bring. The second hour turned uncomfortable, as he watched a steady parade of visitors arrive and disappear behind the elevator doors within minutes of stepping through the entrance, men and women in expensive suits, greeted with warm smiles, offers of coffee, and an urgency that suggested their time was worth protecting. Nobody offered Ethan anything at all. Nobody asked whether his meeting had been delayed, or whether there was anything the staff could do to make the wait a little easier, or even whether he was comfortable in the hard lobby chair. By the third hour, he had become part of the furniture, a quiet presence in a worn jacket that the staff had simply learned to walk past without registering, the way people learn to ignore a chair that has always been there. A maintenance worker rolling a cart of supplies down the hallway slowed as he passed the seating area, something tugging at the edges of his memory, though he could not yet place why the stranger's face felt so unnervingly familiar to him. That man was Samuel Reed, 61 years old, and he had been fixing things inside that building since it was nothing more than a converted garage with a hand-painted sign hanging crookedly above the door. He would return to that nagging feeling more than once before the day was through, unable to shake the sense that he had known those eyes somewhere long before the marble floors and glass elevators had replaced the concrete and folding tables of the very beginning. 5 years earlier, before the illness, before the long and painful absence, Ethan Carter had built this company on a handful of simple principles that he repeated so often his early employees could recite them without thinking twice. Respect every person who walks through that door, he used to say, whether they arrive in a tailored suit or in dusty work boots fresh off a job site. Do not let status decide how kindness gets distributed among the people who cross your threshold. Put the customer first. Always, even when doing so costs the company something in the short term, listen closely to the people working the floor, because they see things the people sitting in corner offices will never notice on their own. Those words had once been painted directly onto the wall of the first real office, right beside a photograph of Ethan and his 3 original employees standing proudly in front of the garage where the entire company had begun. When his wife grew sick, Ethan handed the reins of daily operations to Vanessa Brooks, a polished and fiercely capable executive with an impressive resume and a reputation for squeezing extraordinary growth out of anything she touched with her hands. Under her leadership, the numbers told a story of undeniable triumph. Revenue climbed steadily year over year, quarter after quarter, exceeding projections that once seemed ambitious. The stock price nearly tripled within 4 years, drawing attention from analysts who praised Vanessa's aggressive strategy in every financial publication that covered the industry. Investors sang her praises in every quarterly call, and the board rewarded her handsomely for results that looked, on paper, like everything Ethan could ever have wanted for the company he had built from nothing. But somewhere beneath those impressive numbers, the soul of the company had begun to erode, quietly and steadily, the way rust spreads beneath a fresh coat of paint that nobody bothers to inspect closely enough. Employees stopped asking how they could help someone, and started asking how that someone looked, what they wore, what car sat in the parking garage bearing their name, what title appeared beside their name on a business card. Status became the currency that mattered most inside those walls, and warmth became something reserved only for those who appeared, at a glance, to deserve it. The shift showed itself in small ways at first. A manager rolling his eyes at a customer whose shoes looked worn, a receptionist letting a call go unanswered because the number belonged to a smaller account rather than a major one. Then the small ways became larger ones, an entire department quietly deciding that certain vendors deserved shorter meetings and colder coffee, a training manual rewritten to emphasize efficiency over warmth without anyone quite admitting that was what had happened. New hires learned quickly which behaviors earned praise and which earned nothing at all, and within a few short years an entirely new generation of employees had never even heard the founding principles spoken aloud, let alone lived by them. They knew only the version of the company that existed under Vanessa's leadership. A company where numbers mattered more than names, and where being useful mattered more than being kind. Samuel watched this transformation happen in real time, year after year, as the culture Ethan had built with his own 2 hands slowly gave way to something colder, and far more transactional than anything the founder would have recognized. He raised his concerns more than once over the years, mentioning quietly to supervisors that the way certain customers and certain guests were being treated did not sit right with him, that it was not the company he remembered helping to build from the ground floor up. Nobody listened to him. Not really. He was, after all, only the maintenance man, and maintenance men did not sit in strategy meetings or influence culture from the bottom up, or so everyone in a nicer suit than his own seemed to assume without ever saying it aloud. Back in the lobby, the humiliation only deepened as the afternoon wore steadily on toward evening. Derek Collins emerged from a side hallway, spotted the man in the worn jacket still sitting patiently near the window, and could not resist a comment loud enough for the surrounding desks to hear clearly. He asked, with a smirk he did nothing to hide, whether the man was there applying for a job, perhaps something modest in the mailroom, or the loading dock. A ripple of laughter spread across the nearby cubicles. Quiet, but unmistakable. The kind of laughter that stings more precisely because of how casually it arrives. As though cruelty were simply the tone of the day, another manager passing through added his own remark, telling Ethan that if he genuinely wanted to see the chief executive, he should have scheduled something months in advance through the proper channels, as though the very idea of walking in unannounced amounted to an act of trespass against the building itself. Ethan absorbed each comment without a single flicker of anger crossing his weathered face. He asked only one question, delivered so evenly that it barely registered to the people around him as anything more than idle curiosity. "Is this still Carter Dynamics?" he asked quietly. And not a single person in the room understood what the question actually meant or why it had been asked at all. At one point during the third hour, a well-dressed man arrived asking for a minor scheduling adjustment, and within moments an assistant appeared with a bottle of water, a tablet loaded with the revised itinerary, and an apology for any inconvenience, however small. Ethan watched the interaction unfold from his seat by the window, close enough to hear every word, and felt something settle in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but some quiet combination of both. He thought of a line he used to say often in the earliest years, back when there had been barely enough money to keep the lights on, that a company reveals its truest self not in how it treats those who can reward it, but in how it treats those who apparently cannot. He wondered, sitting there in his worn jacket, how many other ordinary people had sat in that very chair before him, waiting for a fairness that never arrived, before eventually giving up and walking back out through those same glass doors. He remembered saying that very line once to a room of only 3 employees, gathered around a folding table with cold coffee and a single window unit struggling against the summer heat, long before anyone imagined the company would ever occupy a building with marble floors and glass elevators reaching 4 stories into the open sky above them. Melissa, growing visibly irritated by his continued presence near her desk, finally signaled to security that if the man remained seated much longer without proper documentation, he should be escorted out of the building entirely for everyone's comfort. It was around that same moment that Samuel's memory, nagging at him for hours now, finally sharpened into something close to certainty in his chest. He excused himself from his afternoon rounds and made his way down to the archive room in the basement, a space few employees ever bothered to visit anymore, filled with old boxes, retired equipment, and a handful of framed photographs quietly removed from the walls during past renovations nobody had questioned. He dug through a dusty album until his fingers finally found what he had been searching for, a photograph faded at the edges, showing a much younger man standing proudly in front of a garage with a hand-painted sign, flanked by 3 others who had long since moved on or passed away entirely. The young man in that photograph had the same jaw, the same steady eyes, the same quiet posture Samuel had just watched sit patiently in a lobby chair for 3 hours, while an entire company walked past him without so much as a second glance in his direction. Samuel climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding harder than it had in years, and burst back into the lobby with a breathlessness that startled the front desk staff into sudden silence. He walked straight to the man in the worn jacket, his hands trembling slightly as he held out the old photograph, and asked, in a voice thick with disbelief, whether he was looking at Mr. Carter himself standing right there in front of him. Ethan looked up, and for the first time all day, something like warmth broke through his composed exterior, as a small, tired smile crossed his tired face. Samuel felt his eyes sting with sudden emotion, the weight of 5 years spent watching a beloved company drift from its founding spirit, suddenly crashing into a single, overwhelming moment of recognition. He had not expected to feel this strongly. Melissa, watching from behind the desk with growing confusion, assumed the older man had simply lost his grip on reality for a moment, whispering to a coworker that the years must finally be catching up with him at last. Derek laughed outright, telling Samuel to get back to his cart before he embarrassed himself even further, certain in his bones that a man wearing a thrift store jacket could not possibly be the billionaire founder whose name was etched permanently into the building's cornerstone. The doubt did not last long after that. Within minutes, a black sedan pulled up outside the entrance, and Linda Morris stepped out, still dressed in her travel clothes after a flight straight from an early board meeting on the other coast. She had known Ethan Carter for nearly 2 decades, since the earliest days of the company's founding, and she recognized him instantly across the width of the lobby, the recognition hitting her like a sudden physical jolt through her chest. She called out to him using the title few people in that building had used in years, addressing him clearly as Mr. Chairman, her voice carrying across the marble floor and silencing every conversation within earshot instantly. The entire lobby seemed to freeze in that single instant. Phones lowered mid-sentence, footsteps halting mid-stride, as dozens of employees turned to stare at the man they had spent the better part of the afternoon ignoring entirely. Melissa felt the blood drain from her face as the full weight of the last 3 hours settled heavily over her, all at once. Derek's smirk vanished completely, replaced by something closer to panic, as he began mentally retracing every comment he had made within earshot of the man now revealed to be his ultimate employer and the source of his paycheck. Vanessa Brooks emerged from the boardroom at that exact moment, drawn downstairs by the sudden hush that had fallen over the floor below, still entirely unaware of what had unfolded over the preceding several hours. She scanned the lobby with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to controlling every room she entered. But confusion flickered visibly across her face as she took in the strange scene before her, the stunned employees, the trembling maintenance worker, the man in the plain jacket standing calmly at the center of it all. Linda crossed the lobby to meet her halfway, and in a voice that carried both disbelief and quiet fury beneath its surface, explained that the man her staff had left waiting for 3 hours, without so much as a glass of water, was the very founder who had built the entire company from absolutely nothing. Vanessa's expression shifted through several stages in rapid succession, disbelief giving way to dawning horror as she finally understood the full scale of what had just happened under her direct watch. She turned toward Ethan, opening her mouth to offer some kind of hurried explanation or apology, but he raised a hand gently, not unkindly, and simply asked that everyone join him upstairs in the boardroom for a conversation. Inside that room, Ethan did not raise his voice, and he did not need to raise it even once. He took a seat at the head of the long table, the same table where quarterly strategies were debated and futures were decided by people who had never once questioned their own assumptions, and folded his hands in front of him with the stillness of a man who had already made up his mind about several things during those long hours spent in the lobby chair below. He told the room, gathered now in uneasy and heavy silence, that he had spent the last 3 hours watching his own company reveal exactly what it had quietly become in his absence, and that the lesson had proven more valuable than any board report he might otherwise have received that year. He asked for several things to be pulled up immediately on the large screens: security camera footage from the lobby, the visitor log from the front desk stretching back several months, internal email records covering the same period, and any customer complaint files that had been filed but never properly escalated to anyone with real authority. The requests were carried out within minutes, screens around the room filling with data that painted an uncomfortable and increasingly damning picture, one Ethan had already suspected he would find even before the very first file finished loading onto the screen. What the records revealed went far beyond a single unfortunate afternoon of neglect. Hundreds of complaints had quietly piled up over the preceding year, filed by ordinary customers who had walked into the building, expecting basic courtesy, and had instead been met with the very same dismissive treatment Ethan himself had just personally endured that day. People without impressive titles, without expensive clothing, without the right kind of car parked in the garage below, had been quietly shuffled aside, time and again, while wealthier or more visibly important visitors received immediate and enthusiastic attention from staff eager to impress. The pattern was not an accident, nor was it a handful of isolated incidents that could be easily explained away. It was a culture, built slowly and reinforced daily through 1,000 small choices, until treating people according to their appearance had simply become how business was conducted inside those glass walls. One complaint, filed nearly 8 months earlier by a small business owner seeking a modest supply contract, described being told to return another day because his appointment had apparently been given to someone considered more important, despite having confirmed the meeting himself the previous week. Another, filed by an elderly woman inquiring about a long-standing account her late husband had managed for years, described being spoken to slowly and dismissively, as though her age alone disqualified her from being taken seriously by the staff assisting her. A third complaint, more recent than the others, came from a young entrepreneur who had traveled a considerable distance for a scheduled pitch meeting, only to be left waiting in a hallway for nearly 2 hours before being told, without apology, that the meeting had been moved without notice. Ethan read through several of the complaints aloud in a steady voice, each account echoing some version of the humiliation he had just personally lived through that afternoon in a hard lobby chair. The internal investigation that followed moved quickly and left little room for excuses or convenient explanations. Melissa's history revealed a clear pattern of favoritism, stretching back many months. Snide remarks made privately to colleagues about visitors she deemed unworthy of her full attention. Preferential treatment extended freely to anyone who arrived looking sufficiently wealthy or important to matter. Derek's record proved even worse. A long string of deleted appointments, overlooked messages, and a persistent habit of shifting blame onto subordinates whenever his own negligence threatened to come to light, all carefully preserved in email chains he had assumed no one would ever bother reviewing closely. Vanessa, for her part, had known about pieces of this culture for quite some time. Glimpses of it surfacing occasionally in stray comments or the rare complaint that crossed her desk, but she had chosen not to look too closely as long as the revenue numbers kept climbing and the board kept applauding her impressive quarterly results. Ethan asked her directly, in front of the assembled executives seated around the table, what she would have done if the person left waiting that day had simply been an ordinary customer, rather than the company's own founder returning unannounced. Nobody in that room offered an answer, because everyone present already understood, with sinking certainty, exactly what the honest answer would have been. Ethan rose slowly from his chair, and the decisions he made in the minutes that followed came without hesitation or unnecessary theatrics. Delivered in the same measured tone he had maintained throughout the entire afternoon, he signed the paperwork terminating Derek Collins effective immediately, citing the clear pattern of negligence and dishonesty that had just been laid bare across the screens surrounding the table. Melissa Grant followed shortly after, her termination built on months of thoroughly documented favoritism that had shaped the very first impression every single visitor received upon entering the building's doors. Several other managers whose names appeared repeatedly throughout the complaint files were let go in that same sweeping decision, their departures processed before the end of the business day without further discussion. Vanessa was placed on immediate suspension pending a full board review of her leadership, and within the hour, the board convened an emergency session that ended with her formal removal as chief executive officer. A vote passed without a single dissenting voice raised against it. Linda spoke briefly to the remaining board members before the vote was finalized, reminding them in a steady voice that the numbers Vanessa had delivered, however impressive on paper, had come at a cost none of them had bothered to calculate until this very afternoon. She reminded them that a company's reputation, once broken in the eyes of ordinary people, took far longer to rebuild than any quarter of strong earnings could repair, and that the board's job was to protect the whole of what Ethan had built, not merely the portion that showed up neatly on a balance sheet. Several members nodded in quiet agreement, some of them visibly shaken by how easily they too might have overlooked the very same warning signs had they been sitting in that lobby themselves. One older board member admitted, almost under his breath, that he had personally recommended tightening visitor protocols the previous year, without ever considering how those protocols might be used to filter out the very people the company was supposed to serve. Not one person in that room dared to argue against decisions that had clearly been building, quietly and invisibly, for far longer than anyone had previously realized or admitted to themselves. In the midst of the sudden upheaval, Ethan turned to Samuel Reed, the only person in the entire building who had recognized him all day long, and offered him a newly created position as senior advisor on company culture, a role built specifically around the quiet wisdom Samuel had carried through years of being routinely overlooked by everyone around him. The room broke into applause, tentative at first, then increasingly genuine, as if something long buried beneath the marble floors had finally been allowed to surface into the open air. Samuel accepted the offer with tears he no longer bothered to hide, his voice cracking slightly as he thanked Ethan for remembering that the people who kept a building running were often the very same people nobody thought to look at twice. Vanessa, before leaving the boardroom that evening, paused at the door and turned back toward Ethan, asking quietly whether he intended to speak with the press about what had happened. Whether her name would be attached publicly to the failures now spread across every screen in the room. Ethan told her, without malice but without softening the truth either, that what mattered far more than any public statement was what she chose to do next, and whether she would carry the lesson of that afternoon into whatever she built or led in the years ahead. She left without another word, and though the board later issued a brief and carefully worded statement about a change in executive leadership, Ethan never spoke publicly about the specifics of what had gone wrong under her watch, believing the quieter work of rebuilding mattered more than any headline ever could. Ethan understood, even in that first triumphant hour, that firing a handful of people alone would fix absolutely nothing lasting, that the rot had grown far too deep to be solved by terminations, however deserved they might have been in the moment. In the weeks that followed, he rebuilt the company's culture from its very foundation, starting with a set of new policies designed to make his founding values impossible to quietly ignore or slowly abandon ever again. Every incoming chief executive, he decreed in writing, would be required to spend one full day each month working the front reception desk personally, greeting visitors directly, seeing firsthand how easily kindness could be withheld or freely extended depending on nothing more than appearance. Every visitor, regardless of clothing, title, or apparent wealth, would receive the exact same standard of welcome from that point forward, with no exceptions permitted under any circumstance whatsoever. Staff across every department were retrained not merely in procedure but in philosophy, taught to understand that judging a person by their clothing or their manner of arrival said far more about the company itself than it ever could about the visitor standing before them. A direct channel was created, allowing complaints to reach the chairman's office immediately, bypassing the layers of middle management that had previously smothered legitimate concerns long before they ever had a chance to surface into daylight. Ethan also insisted on a new hiring practice, one that placed as much weight on a candidate's treatment of a receptionist during the interview process as on their answers to formal questions about strategy or experience, reasoning that how a person spoke to someone with no power to hire them revealed more character than any resume ever could. He commissioned a new mural for the lobby wall, not of glass towers or stock charts, but of the original garage, painted exactly as it had looked the day the company began, so that every visitor and every employee passing through would be reminded daily of where the whole enterprise had actually started. He also asked that a simple plaque be placed near the front desk, inscribed with words he had once painted himself on that very first wall so many years earlier, so that no manager could ever again claim they had forgotten the values the company was meant to stand for. During one of the earliest training sessions, a young employee raised her hand and asked Samuel, somewhat nervously, whether the changes were simply another passing initiative that would fade once the excitement of the founder's return wore off, as so many corporate initiatives tended to do after the first few weeks. Samuel considered the question seriously before answering, telling her that he had watched plenty of policies come and go over the decades, but that this one felt different because it was not built on a slogan or a poster taped to a break room wall. It was built on a man who had sat in that very lobby for 3 hours himself, who had felt firsthand exactly what it meant to be dismissed and who now had both the memory and the authority to make sure it never happened to anyone else again. The young woman nodded slowly, and by the end of the session, she was the one asking the most thoughtful questions about how she might carry the new standard into her own daily interactions with visitors. Samuel became a fixture in those retraining sessions, standing before rooms full of employees who had once walked past him without a second glance, sharing stories from the earliest days of the company that most of them had genuinely never heard before that afternoon. He spoke of folding tables and second-hand chairs, of a founder who used to personally carry coffee out to visiting clients, regardless of how large or small their business might eventually turn out to be worth. He spoke of a philosophy built not on quarterly profit margins, but on the simple and unshakable belief that every person who walked through the door deserved to be treated with basic dignity, no matter what. Slowly, something began to shift across the entire building, not overnight, and not without quiet resistance from a few longtime staff, who preferred the comfort of the old hierarchy they had grown accustomed to. But, steadily, in the small daily choices employees began making without needing to be reminded or told, the change took hold in a way that felt real, rather than performed for an audience. People began to understand, many of them for the very first time, that what had truly built Carter Dynamics into a billion-dollar company was never the glass, the steel, or the impressive profit statements celebrated so loudly in quarterly reports. It had always been something far simpler and far harder to measure on any spreadsheet, the way people chose to treat one another when nothing obvious stood to be gained from a small act of kindness. Word of what had happened that afternoon eventually spread beyond the walls of Carter Dynamics itself, carried through industry circles by people who had heard some version of the story secondhand, embellished here and there but true in its essential shape. Other companies began quietly reviewing their own visitor policies, their own hiring practices, their own unwritten assumptions about who deserved warmth and who did not. Ethan never sought credit for starting that wider conversation, and he rarely spoke publicly about the day itself, preferring instead to let the changed atmosphere inside his own building speak for whatever lesson needed to be learned by anyone paying attention. 3 months later, on an ordinary afternoon, much like the one that had started everything, a man dressed in plain and unremarkable clothing walked through the front doors of Carter Dynamics and approached the reception desk without announcing himself in any particular way. The new receptionist rose immediately from her seat, offering a genuine and unhurried smile before he had even finished stating his name aloud, asking warmly whether he would like something to drink, while she confirmed the details of his appointment. She inquired about his schedule with visible patience and care, treating him with precisely the same attentiveness she would have shown any executive stepping off the elevator in a tailored suit and polished shoes. What she did not know, and would not learn until much later that week, was that the man standing before her had been sent specifically to test whether the culture Ethan had rebuilt was genuine or merely a performance staged for the founder's benefit alone, a secret evaluator working on behalf of a much larger client, considering a lasting partnership. Satisfied by everything he witnessed and quietly moved by a sincerity he could not have manufactured on demand, no matter how hard anyone tried, the man went on to sign a contract worth several $100 million before the end of that same week. The largest single deal the company had closed in its entire history. When asked later, during the signing itself, what had ultimately convinced him to trust Carter Dynamics over several competing offers from larger and more established firms, he did not mention the numbers in the proposal or the polish of the presentation his account team had prepared for weeks in advance. He mentioned instead a young receptionist who had offered him a cup of coffee without knowing his name, who had smiled at him the same way she would have smiled at anyone else walking through those doors on an ordinary afternoon. From the floor above, standing quietly near the railing that overlooked the lobby below, Ethan watched the entire exchange unfold in real time, a small and satisfied smile settling slowly across his weathered face as he observed the very scene that had once denied him basic decency now being extended freely and warmly to a complete stranger. Samuel approached and stood beside him at the railing, following his gaze down toward the reception desk below, and asked simply what he thought of everything he was seeing unfold beneath them. Ethan considered the question for a long, quiet moment before answering. his voice steady and certain, carrying the full weight of everything the two of them had lived through together over the preceding months of rebuilding. The day he had been forced to sit in that lobby chair for 3 long, humiliating hours, ignored and dismissed by the very people meant to represent everything he had spent years building, had turned out to be the single best thing that could have happened to the company he loved. It had shown him, more clearly than any report or meeting ever could have managed, exactly what needed to be fixed, and it had given him the rare chance to fix it before the damage became permanent and irreversible. Samuel mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the receptionist working the desk that afternoon had no idea how much rested on the small kindness she had just extended to a stranger, asking for nothing more than a moment of her attention. Ethan smiled at that, saying that most kindness worked exactly that way, quietly, without an audience, offered by people who never expected it to matter to anyone beyond the person standing right in front of them. He added that he intended to keep the secret evaluator program running indefinitely, not to catch employees behaving badly, but to remind every level of leadership that the standard applied every single day, not only when someone important happened to be watching. Samuel laughed softly at that, admitting that for years he had been the quiet evaluator nobody thought to notice. Watching the company drift further from itself with every passing season, unable to do anything but hope someone eventually remembered to look, the two men stood together in comfortable silence as the afternoon light spread slowly across the marble floor below them, watching the daily rhythm of a company gradually rediscovering the values it had nearly lost forever along the way. A company, Ethan understood now more deeply than he ever had before returning that morning, is never truly measured by the profits it reports or the towers it manages to build toward the open sky above. It is measured instead by something far quieter and far more revealing than any balance sheet could ever capture. The way it chooses to treat the people who seem, at first glance, to offer nothing at all in return for that kindness. That, more than any figure printed in a quarterly report, was the inheritance Ethan hoped to leave behind, not a taller building or a larger valuation, but a place where a stranger in a worn jacket could still walk through the front doors and be treated exactly as he deserved, without ever needing to say who he really was, and without ever needing to prove, through wealth or title or connection, that he was worthy of the simple courtesy every person walking through those doors ought to receive as a matter of course.